the 20th Friday in August. I'm speaking with Mr. Harold Loden. Mr. Loden, did I pronounce your name correctly? It's Harold D. Loden. What does the D stand for?
Dickson, D-I-C-K-S-O-N.
And Mr. Loden, would you tell me a little bit of your experiences during the World War II era?
Well, I had, if everybody fought the war like I did, we probably wouldn't have won it. But anyhow, when I went into the Air Force, I received my commission in aerial photography and was assigned to the mapping wing of the Air Force, because at the time of the starting of the war, and if you don't mind, I'll refer to some notes here.
By all means.
That the Earth's surface composed 58 million square miles, but at the time the war started, only 7% of it had been adequately mapped. And so maps, of course, were absolutely essential in the aerial type of warfare that we had in World War II. So that I was assigned to the 311th Photographic Wing, and from that then to the 7th Geodetic Control Squadron. And what the Geodetic Control Squadron did was, after the airplanes equipped with special camera devices called trimetragon, in which you had 3 cameras, 1 in the middle and 2 pointing out at an angle, and they would fly in strips that would take pictures about 20 miles wide, then come back and take pictures 20 miles wide of, and for example, where I was in the upper part of the Amazon Valley. The pictures themselves are of no value, because you've got to know where they are. So the job of the Geodetic Squadron, and there were probably no more during the entire conflict, maybe less than 100 people involved in doing this kind of work. We would take a picture made by these people who flew the planes and took the aerial photographs, and locate on there a point that could be well identified and established, such as a small town with a square in the middle of it, or a point on the river, or anything that was distinguishable. We would go to that point whichever way we could. Most of my time we spent going in a small 2-engine amphibian airplane, land on the river and get out and sit there for the length of time it took to do our job. What we were doing was establishing latitude and longitude within a few feet of accuracy. Just like the ships in the airplanes used to do a 3-star fix, we would do a 60-star fix. And that way we'd have to have 15 stars in each of the 4 quadrants. And then with some mathematical formula we could determine exactly where we were. Sometimes we didn't know which side of the equator we would want, but we could do this. And it was essential that we have 60 stars in order to do it accurately. Sometimes we would, so when nighttime came, we would set up our little trimetragon piece of equipment called an astrolabe, which was nothing in the world but a telescope with a prism on the end of it, and a vial of a plate of mercury on the bottom. And we would catch the reflection of the star, and we had a book of stars. We knew where every star was at every minute of the day. So that we would turn to a certain degree on the equipment, and when that star, we'd find that star, and when it passed over that point into the prism, we'd time it, and that was exactly where we were. We did that 60 times. If we only got 30, that day night work was done, was through, wiped off. And sometimes we'd stay in a place 15 to 20 days, particularly, as you could imagine, during the rainy season in Brazil, and you'd get halfway through getting your work done, and a cloud would come over and you couldn't see any more stars, so we had to start all over again. Sometimes we'd stay at a place for a couple of weeks. One time, in order to get to a little town, which we could see on the map and had a small town, had a little village square, was a very prominent location. We went 22 days on a dugout canoe to get up to this place. Flew as far as we could in the plane and then went with canoe. So that was the kind of job I did for most of that, for all that year I was in Brazil.
And which year are we talking about, sir?
I went down there in 43 and came back in 44.
From summer to summer or some
Well,
other time of the year?
yeah, it was from about September to September, I guess.
Thank you.
And we knew we had to do these points about every 50 miles. And there was about 5 or 6 crews of us doing these at different places. There was a little place right not far from Manaus, where I was the city in which we lived. We had no army facilities. We rented a house and a cook and bought our own food and so forth. And I was to go up to this place to to get the latitude and longitude. And in order to get there, we had to rent a boat and take some Brazilian Army personnel with us. And I had made arrangements for all of that. And just about the time I was to leave, we got a telegram from Washington asking several of us to come back to the States and take a 21-day delay en route to go to Denver and get an overseas examination while we were at home to immediately go back overseas again. At that time, presumably, it was to be with the Russians to map part of Siberia. That never came to pass. But the story I was telling is I turned over my equipment to another young man who had just arrived maybe a few weeks before, and he went up the river to this point. And as they turned around the river, started the river, there were a bunch of Indians on the bank. So he said, well, let's get out and take a picture. All this came from one survivor. So they pulled up to the bank in the boat, got out, started to take a picture. And when they did, the Indians started screaming evil eye, something like that, and killed every one of them with bows and arrows, except one person who got free and came back, was able to eventually get back down the river to Manaus. So as I say, I was lucky, my part of me. I don't think I would have gotten killed, but I could have. So I was very lucky. Then when I came back to the States, I went to Denver, and I stayed there for, seemed like forever, waiting on an assignment to go somewhere. And finally I got so bored, I read an article in one of the notices that the Army was looking for people to go to military government school and Japanese language school. So it says if you are accepted, you'll be discharged at under the same conditions as anybody else. Well, I was accepted, but they didn't discharge me under the same conditions. I had to stay 12 months to the day after I would normally have been discharged with my accumulation of points. The dropping of the atomic bomb was our graduation present. About 2 weeks before we had finished our 6-month school, we immediately left to go to Japan. Got to Japan and was sitting in a replacement center, which had been the old Japanese Army's equivalent of West Point. And we got notice for about 6 of us to leave and go down to Yokohama and get on a ship and go, and we didn't know where, sealed orders. So we got 6 of us get on this Victory ship, which is a cargo ship, and we sailed around the southern part of the island of Japan. And the captain called us in one day and says, where are you going? We said, well, we don't know. We just put on your ship, we go, and you can get off where you tell us you're there. He said, well, are you going to China? We said, we don't know. He said, well, I can't find on the map the place that we're supposed to go. Our orders say we're to go to Incheon, But I can't find anything on my map that says where that is. The map says Jin-sen, or Ten-sen. Well, what had happened, nobody in Washington, I'm sure, ever dreamed that Korea was there and would become a very focal point in world history. Because during the 6 months I studied Japanese language, government, history, everything, Korea was never mentioned one time. And the only reason the 38th parallel is there was that the Russians were coming down and somebody woke up and said, well, if we don't stop them, they're going to take all of Korea, so they agreed on the 38th parallel, and that's how it happened.
So the fact that Japan had occupied Korea was never discussed?
No, well, yeah, we discussed the fact that Japan occupied, from a Japanese history standpoint, Japan occupied Korea and occupied China and so forth. But never once was there any mention of Korea in terms of the World War II military establishment. Because I don't think they ever thought about it or dreamed it, because we were thinking about having to fight ourselves city by city through Japan. And well, when it all ended so suddenly, there was Korea sitting out there that nobody ever thought about. So they stopped the line, and so they sent us to Korea. We didn't know where we were going, but anyhow, what happened was, in Japan, during that time, every person, every town, every person, everything in Japan had two names, one Japanese, one Korean. In the case of Incheon, which is the main port on the Yellow Sea near Seoul, it was called Jinsen by the Japanese. When we left Yokohama, the captain of the ship was looking at a map, and he couldn't find the map to agree with his orders of where to go. So what we had to do, he turned around, and we came back all the way to the entrance of Yokohama Bay, and finally by radio he found out that he'd been given a Japanese map instead of a Korean map. So we turned around and went back to Incheon. I was assigned as head of the agricultural section in the Department of Agriculture with its Korean counterparts, in charge of everything except rice. And the interesting thing was I was in charge of vegetables. Vegetable seed production is a high-income crop. The Japanese grew all of the vegetable seed in Japan and shipped them to Korea each year to get the high-income crop on the island of Japan. Well, one day some Koreans came into my office and said, we got a problem. We don't have any vegetable seed to plant this year's crop. And I said, well, why? And they said, well, it's supposed to be shipped from Japan, and it never did get here. We don't know where it is. We don't know anything about it. We don't know if it's been shipped or it has not been shipped. So we told that to the commanding general, General Lurch, and so he wrote a letter to General MacArthur, who apparently they were classmates or close friends through the service. So we wrote the letter that we wanted MacArthur's people to see, but then Lurch took it and put a paragraph, a personal paragraph, that, Dear Doug, this will introduce Lieutenant Loden, and so forth and so on. And I wish I'd had a copy of that letter, but I don't have it. Anyhow, he gave me that letter, and I flew to Tokyo and went to MacArthur's office, gave it to the people, and told them that the seed presumably came from a company in Kyoto. So I took the overnight train from Tokyo to Kyoto, which was still running. Very few were running in the neighborhood of the Lloyd cities. But Kyoto was never bombed because it was a holy city, and there was never any bombing at all in the city of Kyoto. I went to Kyoto, went to this fellow's office, and he said, yes, we shipped the seed. Went on such and such a ship out of such and such a port on the west coast of the country. But what happened was it had set sail the day that the bomb, or the day after the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, before the bomb was dropped. And of course it headed to the closest point of land, which happened to be a North Korean port rather than a South Korean port. So all of the vegetable seed to plant the Korean vegetable crop were in North Korea. So when we tried to trade with the Russians to get them back, we never got not a seed back. We'd meet with the Russians at night or during the daytime in conferences to exchange rice for fertilizer, because North Korea had all the fertilizer, South Korea had all the rice. We never did anything except drink a little vodka. We never accomplished anything by doing that. But the experience of going to MacArthur's headquarters, getting to not see him, of course. Everybody saw him every day when he walked out the building. Every day at 1 o'clock exactly, he walked out the door, got in his car, and went home. Not a gun in Japan at that time at all. But those are the kind of experiences I had during the war, which make you the kind you like to remember rather than those that most people who went to the war had that they don't want to remember.
Had you had a background in agriculture before your time in the
Yes, I had. That's how I happened to be in the Air Force. I graduated from the University of Georgia in agriculture, and I went to work with immediately in 1939. I had a master's, BS and MS degree.
From this university?
From university. I went to and worked with Soil Conservation Service, and we were using aerial photographs to make farm plans, and had picture of a man's farm and outline all that we were trying to do to conserve the soil and all of this. Well, the Air Force had an air base in the county where I was down in South Alabama, and I was trying to get into the service. I didn't want to wait and be drafted, so I was trying to volunteer in the service. So I went down, I read one day that I tried to get in the Air Force, and I couldn't. My eyes didn't pass the examination. So I read one day in the paper they had relaxed the requirements for navigation, for navigators. So I went to the air base, went to the place, and so the fellow says, well, let me see if your eyes will let you get in aviation cadet school to be a navigator. So he checked, still wouldn't do it. So we got talking about what I did, and I told him what I did. He said, well, you know, said, I have never, says, you know, we have an aerial photographic cadet school to get commissioned, where you don't have to pass physical eye examination. Said, I never have submitted one. So let me see if I can fill this out because of the experience you've had working with aerial photographs and so forth in your work. And so we did. He said, I don't know if it'll get you in the Air Force or not. And about 2 weeks later, I got a letter addressed Private Harold Loden, so I knew that I was in the Air Force. And from there, I got my commission in air photography, and that's how I ended up in the photographic wing of the Air Force.
Where in Lower Alabama had you been near that Air Force base?
Well, the Air Force base was just right outside of Headland, Alabama, and I was living in Abbeville.
Well, that's between Dothan and
Eufaula. Yep.
And upon returning, where did you go? Where did you?
You mean after the service?
Yes, indeed.
Well, I was in the service 5 years to the day exactly. I was discharged as a major, and well, I was retired. Matter of fact, I never was discharged. I retired as a major. I went back down to Abbeville, Alabama, where I came from, and was there about a couple of months. And Professor W.O. Collins, who was the head of the Department of Agronomy here at the university, under who I had studied, called me one day and asked me if I would be interested in coming to the university to teach. And because when I was there, I had majored in cotton production and genetics. That was my field, even though I ended up doing soil conservation work to get a job. So I said, well, yeah, I'd like to come back to the university and teach, but I don't think you can pay me enough money. I just got a promotion to $2,700 a year in the civil service. I've just been promoted, got a $700 raise. He laughed later and told me that I knew I had you, because then he said, well, I'll give you $2,700 for 9 months, and if you teach in the summer school, we'll pay you extra. So that's how I came back to the university. And I stayed here until 1951. I taught in the agronomy department. I went to Texas A&M during part of that time, and then got my doctorate degree in genetics. Came back to the university and was teaching, and then when they reorganized the university, the experiment station system, I was asked to be the head of the Georgia station, or the university station, here at the college. And that was the beginning of that. And,
what year was that?
1950. And I left here in 1951, went to work for a the world's largest cotton company, and to head up their cotton breeding program and variety development program in West Texas. And I stayed with them till I took early retirement in 1955. I enlarged the business, and we had businesses. I had units scattered all over the world. I had a business in South Africa, one in Brazil, Mexico. We had distributorships in Japan. Later, the fellow that I went to see in Kyoto about the seed for Korea became one of my customers after the war. The same fellow that was in the seed company in Kyoto. So then I retired from that in 1973, and went to Washington and headed up the American Seed Trade Association, and traveled all over the world in the interest of American seedsmen. And for 10 years, and retired, moved back to Athens 11 years ago.
So you retired, moved back to Athens about 1982 or 3.
83.
And your 10 years in Washington,
1973 to 83.
And did you marry? Do you have kids? What are their names?
I had married before I went into the Air Force. And my wife had to sign a statement she was self-supporting in order for me to be accepted into the Air Force. We never had any children. My wife grew up here. I grew up out in the country. And we liked coming back to Athens because, you know, in a city like Athens, there are two parts, the university and the non-university. And they mix just about like oil and water in most cases, as you know. By being a part of the university, my wife having been reared here, worked here, we were able, when we were here on the faculty, to have friends in both the college and in the city. And when I moved back here in 1983, we still had some of the same people here that we, both university people and non-university people. When I moved out and built a house out where I live,
which is where?
Drayton Square, was right off of Barnett Shoals. The neighbor across the street was a fellow who came here at the same year I did as head of the animal husbandry department. Fellow up the street was one who worked with me when I was in Alabama in the Soil Conservation Service. And many of the people that are our friends today, both in the city and ex-university, because they've all retired now. So that we have friends on both sides of the thing. One other thing that's not probably, has nothing to do with the war, that's of interest, might be of interest. When I retired from the American Seed Trade Association, without me knowing anything about it, my friends formed a little committee and wrote to my friends all around the world to send a contribution for a retirement gift. Well, as a matter of fact, about 20-odd Japanese came from Japan to San Francisco for my retirement party. That's, but I had friends, I probably knew more people, and probably still do, knew more people in the seed business around the world than anybody else ever did or ever has. But when they did, they got the money in, They gave me a set of golf clubs and gave my wife a washer and dryer for our new house, and we had about $25,000 left over. So the company from which I had retired originally before I went to Washington added $5,000, so there was $30,000, and the committee put it together as a scholarship at the university called the Harold and Celestia Loden Scholarship, which is given to an undergraduate in agronomy, plant pathology, and horticulture, which are my fields. And that scholarship now has grown to about $70,000, more than $70,000. We give one scholarship a year for which the college faculty, the scholarship committee selects $4,000 a year. And it's my wife and my plan that as we can work it in, tax-wise and everything else, to see that that fund gets up to $100,000. So that'll be something be here long after we're gone.
It's a great achievement. Would you tell me your wife's maiden name?
Celestia, Celestia. And a lot of people call her Celeste, but she was named after an aunt of hers who was Celestia.
Well,
I say she was Celestia Foster.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And you mentioned to me that you had grown up in Colbert.
Colbert.
Did you have roots in Headland, Alabama as well? Or
No.
That was your job?
When I went to work for the Soil Conservation Service, I went first to Marion, Alabama, and stayed a few months on a training deal. Then I moved down to Dothan and stayed for a month or two, and then was moved up to Abbeville when we opened up an office in Abbeville. And that was my roots to South Alabama.
So, would you tell me some of your connection to the Northeast Georgia area and Colbert?
Well, my father was a country doctor. Graduated from what at that time was known as Atlanta Medical College, which later became Emory Medical College. Country doctors in the days when I was a little fella growing up made calls in the afternoon, stayed in the office in the morning, and then they made calls all night when people called, to come. And we get paid in pigs and chickens and watermelon, and sometimes some money. Anyhow, it was the kind of life that my father liked. He grew up in North Georgia, up in Stevens County. He became ill when he was about 42, 43 years old, and so the doctors told him it was a combination of high blood pressure and kidney trouble. Told him, said, well, if you'll quit work and just kind of do nothing for a while, you'll get along all right. So he would sit around the house, and people come to the house to ask him for medical advice and so forth, and call him. So finally one day he said, well, I'm just not going to sit around and do nothing. I'm going to go ahead and work as long as I live. And so then he did. He died when he was 44 years old. That was just the hard life of a doctor in those days. At that time I heard a doctor here in Athens say that during that time, in the 30s, early 30s, there were 11 doctors in Athens. Today there are probably well over 200, maybe 300, I don't know.
How old were you when he died?
12 years old. We had a farm, and my mother and I ran the farm. It was located about halfway between Colbert and Hull. We lived in Colbert, but we had this farm, and it was that farm that we were able to get enough money together to go to school on.
Were you an only child?
I had two sisters, younger than I, both of whom have passed away.
And was there a certain one crop or another that you raised in those days?
Cotton. Athens was a cotton capital of nothing. There was nothing grown here hardly except cotton. The only reason you grew corn was to feed the mules to raise the cotton. So that Athens was a great cotton center. It was, and they had an oil mill, cottonseed crushing oil mill. The economy of Northeast Georgia was cotton.
Can you describe coming to Athens with cotton for me?
To what?
Can you describe taking your cotton to market or?
Well, in Colbert, we had 2 cotton gins. And you would haul, the cotton would go to after it was hand-picked out of the field, it would be transported to the gin by a mule wagon. And gin and the bale of cotton then would be either taken up to the depot on the platform, and the 2 or 3 merchants in town who bought cotton would come out and sample it and bid on it and buy it. In our case, cotton at that time was, right after my father died, cotton was worth about 5 cents a pound. I remember very well that we had, there lived on our farm a total of 99 black people, and we were really responsible for them. We came to town on the weekends and bought flour and salt and pork and that sort of stuff and for them, and they paid for it in the fall out of their part of the crop, and what they had to pay for it was cotton. So we got half the cotton, they got half the cotton that was grown. We furnished the fertilizer, and they furnished the labor, and we furnished the mules, and all of it. So what we did, we were fortunate enough to have a little money, and rather than have to sell the cotton at a nickel, we just paid the tenants their part in money and kept it. And we had cotton scattered all over our yard and in every building we had. And finally, when it got to 10 cents a pound, we sold it. And that was, I guess my father died in 1931, and this was probably 1934 or something, 33 or 34, right after the beginning of the Roosevelt administration.
Did you use mules a lot?
That's all we had was mules.
Where'd you get them?
Well, you bought the mules from a mule barn. Atlanta was the largest mule auction in the world. And people would go to Atlanta who ran, say, the livery, what they call a livery stable. He'd go to Atlanta to the mule auction. The mules came, they used to always think they came from Missouri, but I don't know what they did or not. That's what they call the Missouri mules, And so the livery man would go buy, the merchant would go buy mules, and then you would trade mules with him or buy a mule with him. There were even itinerant gypsies who came through the country selling mules, and you had to be rather careful about buying mules from a gypsy because they weren't exactly what they were supposed to be most of the time. But it was all mules. I remember when we bought our first tractor. It was, gosh, I was long. There was nothing, no way to farm except mules walking behind on one row at a time plowing. And the average size of a crop that one person could handle was probably 10, 12, 15 acres.
What did you think of Roosevelt?
What
did you think of Roosevelt at the time, 50, 60?
Roosevelt did some great things for this country. When I became old enough to vote, he was running against Wendell Willkie. I voted for Wendell Willkie. I didn't vote for Roosevelt. But the things that Roosevelt did, and did quick, were the salvation of this country in the early part of 1930s. First job I ever had was a water boy on a construction gang paving the road from Athens, from the Madison County line to Danielsville. And I made 7 cents an hour as a water boy. That was, and then immediately after the New Deal programs came in, then when I went to college, I could make 20 cents an hour working in a grocery store. So that, but Roosevelt was a salvation for this part of the country. Some of the things he did, I don't agree with, but you've got to on balance say that Roosevelt was a great president for this country.
Where was that grocery store you worked at for 20 cents an hour?
It was the A&P grocery store located on Broad Street, just about where Blimpie's is now. And Rogers Brothers was another grocery store, and they were side by side. You didn't, we didn't have the supermarket. The first supermarket came to Athens a little later, was located right above where the Palace Theater is, where the parking lot is. There was a self-service walk-in store. That was the first one. You go in and, but when I worked in the grocery store and going to college, a lady would come in with a long grocery list, and she'd say, I want a pound of cheese. So I'd go back here and get the cheese. And then she wanted a pound of coffee, and you walk up there and get that. And you walk yourself to death trying to manually service every single item on a grocery list. Finally, I got to where sometime I'd know them. I would ask the lady, you let me have the list, and I'll go, and I'd take it where I didn't have to do so much walking. But the time you left there at 11 o'clock at night, you were born dead tired. But that, I made 20 cents an hour working on the weekends for A&P Tea Company.
What did you think of Harry Truman at the time?
Do what?
What did you think of Harry Truman at the time?
I admired Harry Truman. I think that Harry Truman will probably come out to be one of the greatest presidents we ever had. Oddly enough, my personal belief, if Richard Nixon had had the guts that Harry Truman had, and says, hell yes, I had the tapes and I burned them, forget about it. That's what Harry Truman would have done. Nixon would have, the history would have been changed.
It's one of those paradoxes.
That's right.
I want to take you back to your service in Brazil in the Amazon, because I'm particularly curious. That was an unusual place to be. Can you tell me a little bit more about what it felt like to be in such an unusual place during those years?
Well, yeah, it was. It was not all that unusual, except that it was an entirely different culture. I had a very interesting experience.
Did you get some Portuguese?
I learned Portuguese. Matter of fact, when I did my doctorate at Texas A&M, I used Portuguese as one of my languages. The first trip we went on, that 22-day dugout canoe, we carried an interpreter. Well, an interpreter is another third increase in weight and groceries and everything else, so we said, no more interpreters. So we went out without an interpreter and did pointing and this sort of thing and got by. We'd go to the movies, and there were American movies with Portuguese subtitles. And that's where I learned most of my Portuguese. Then I studied Portuguese some. But when I was in Manaus is at the beginning of the Amazon River. And it was a rubber boom in the natural rubber boom time. They built a big opera house. They brought opera stars from Italy wouldn't even let them stop at Belém, which is on the coast, because of the jealousy between the two cities. My wife wrote me a letter and said, we can't find bobby pins, that ladies use in their hair back in those days. It was essential, I guess, that they have. Would you see if you can find me some bobby pins? So I went down in Manaus. It was a pretty good-sized town. Manaus was a good-sized town. Had a market and had stores, and maybe 15 feet wide and 12 feet deep, and pulled down the front at night, that sort of thing. So I walked up to this lady in there, and I asked her, and I could speak Portuguese at that time enough, if she had any bobby pins, and she did, and I bought a couple of boxes of bobby pins. So then she reached under the counter and pulled out an envelope and said to me, in Portuguese, of course, do you know where this place is? And it says, D. Lewis and Sons, Broad Street, Athens, Georgia. I said, yeah, I live there. I went to school there. I know where the D. Lewis son is. He said, well, D. Lewis's son is married to my daughter. And D. Lewis is my brother. And the story, which I later learned in visits to their home and so forth, was that in Lebanon there was a brother and a sister married, a brother and a sister. One of the brothers and his wife came to Athens And Joe Lewis, who still lives here and has a Persian rug company, a good friend of mine, came over here with a tag on his shirt on the boat from Lebanon. And his father had this store on Broad Street. The other brother, who had married the sister of Dave Lewis, went to Manaus because that was the big boom town country.
In Brazil?
In Brazil. And so when I left, they come back to Athens, when I left Manaus, they gave me a box of things to bring back to their family. And I told them, I said, you know, the lady, not only do I know where Dave Lewis' store is, I have seen your daughter and her husband, and because they lived just across the street from me, and I lived for a while in the Kappa Sigma house on Millage Avenue, and across the street from the Persian Rug Company. And Joe Lewis and his family lived in the houses right where the Waffle House of that is now, right in that area. And I could see the kids coming and going and everything when I was in school. And the reason I remember it because his sons were crippled and the daughters were pushing his sons in a little wheelchair. And I knew all of that before I ever went to Brazil, and then there ran into that. Now that's a very unusual experience, but had nothing to do with the war.
Yeah, well, it certainly has to do with local history. Was there a strategic reason for mapping Brazil?
Yes. Well, first of all, the places where we sent these people, the geodetic squadron, we sent, in other words, in 1942, we went to Alaska, Newfoundland, and Brazil, Alaska again, Africa, Upper Amazon. There was all the way down to 1945. Another thing there is that when I went to when I was in military government school at University of Virginia, I had a call from my friend who was still in Denver waiting assignment on another geodetic mission, saying we have been assigned a mission in Paraguay, and if you could get the Army to release you there, you can come back with us. So I asked for a release from the military government school, and they wouldn't give it to me. So that group that I had been with in Brazil, most of them and a few more, left and went to Paraguay. When the war was over, they were coming home, and they had a big celebration in Asunción. And I later, in traveling and business-wise in Paraguay, talked to people who knew the specifics of this. They had a big party, left the next morning, and apparently the pilot was still not completely recovered from his celebration, and they flew right straight into a mountain and killed every one of them. So I didn't have any real problem worrying about staying in the Army longer than I should have, because I could well have been on that airplane.
Well, I'm very grateful you came in today. I'd like to ask you if I could photocopy some of your notes.
Yeah, well, this is a article that appeared in some publication. I'm not sure exactly. Well, the Air Force magazine in 1945, and it has a history of is a story about the geodetic work. And actually, in here, without me knowing it, I got this only a year or two ago, is a picture of the plane in which we traveled in Brazil with me outside walking up to the plane in 43, right? So, and then one ambitious young fellow, not young anymore, is putting together a history of this geodetic squadrons and the work. So he wrote all those, and they're not maybe 50 or 75 on the list, and asked them to make a little report on what they did while they were in the service, and their recollections, and he's going to try to put it together in a publication. So I wrote this about 2 or 3 months ago, and that was when John Bonner suggested I come over and talk to you about it. So if you want to make a photocopy of this, you're very welcome to do so. Both of them.
Let me ask you one question to sum up. If you were speaking to younger people, I usually ask this last, people who only knew of the World War II era through history books or videotapes, what do you think was most important from that time 50 years ago? What would you underline the most from what
Well, I guess what I go back to the answer I didn't give you the why we were mapping in Brazil. The reason we were mapping in Brazil is that the war plans were that we were going to have to defend the Western Hemisphere from the Germans, and as soon as they completed the conquest of North Africa, the next place would be the point at Recife, and that part of the closest point of Brazil to Africa, and we expected that there would be movement. We were building army camps and facilities in Brazil along the coast. And all, as we used to say, the day the North African invasion was a success. And we knew that we were going to go that way instead of have to fight them coming this way. They quit building these camps even to the point of not finishing driving a nail. You know, but that's why we had to have maps of because we anticipated that that was where we were going to be fighting, and that's where we're going to have to send people across.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Mr. Loden.
Glad to do it. Now I can get time to get them up as you're
welcome. Yes, I can do it quickly.
And here's the kind of thing that I was telling you about. The way that the work that we did was to, you ready?
Yeah.
The work we did was used to make a map. Information with the latitude and longitude was of no value by itself, like the photographs were of no value. But all those photographs were flown by the planes, and the work that we did were sent to Peterson Field, where they made the aeronautical charts. And what they did, they had a great big building like a Coliseum, you know, like say the University Coliseum or bigger, in which they had projected out on the floor the kind of map that they were going to make, you know. And what they did, they had the latitude and longitude, of course they could draw it all off and measure it. Because they'd take the picture that we had with the latitude and longitude on it and nail it in the floor every 50 miles. Then they would squeeze all of these other photographs in to make it so they could see where, but you knew where it was, because the photographs, the plane goes up and down, the plane flies sideways. Not true. You had to know where one point was and squeeze all the others in between those points, and that's the way they made the maps.
Who were your bosses? Who did you report to?
When?
Thinking of this time mapping in Brazil.
Well, we had the leadership of the geodetic squadron came from the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey. And people who were civilians in the Coast and Geodetic Survey were given commissions in the Army, in the Air Force. And the man who was in charge of the unit I was in was a major, and I think his name was Duran or something like that. But he was not a military man, but he was given a commission and was the commanding officer of those of us who were doing this work.
And you were married at the time?
I was married at the time.
What year did you marry?
1909.
And was it difficult to correspond?
No.
Was your mail censored?
Well, sometimes. I think it was spot censored, but we knew we weren't going to. I couldn't tell my wife where I was, but she could figure it out one way. That's the reason she wrote me to get the bobby pin, because she knew I was in Brazil. But we self-censored our mail. I don't think we were, and I don't think we could have written anything that would have helped the enemy anyhow.
What do you think of all those guys who retired from the German side in Argentina and Venezuela?
That's unbelievable.
Did you see anything of the politics of the country while you were there at the time?
Well, in Brazil, no, but in my business career, I traveled widely all over Brazil and all of South America and everywhere, so I could see the politics involved there, of course.
If I may, any thoughts about development along that basin of the Amazon and the rainforest and those issues?
Well, yes. I think we're beginning to see some reason coming forth against the idea that too many people had that, well, just wiping out the country and we're going to do this. When I went to Brazil, for example, in my job, Brazil was just growing out into the jungle all the time. They would eliminate the trees and plant it in grass, and it became a cattle country. Then once they got rid of the stumps and got rid of it, they could begin to farm. And that's where we have the soybean production. And I helped start soybean production in Brazil. Cotton was the main crop that brought the land back in. Then after that became soybeans stayed on the flat land, and coffee trees came in the other. But I don't buy all the stories you hear about the demolition of the rainforest, and the demolition of the rainforest is going to kill the rest of us in the world. I don't buy all that story.